What are Christian values? The 7 deadly sins could be summed up as a warning not to overindulge. Their antecedents are things like patience, humility, compassion and charity. These values are a guide for how to live a good life. They have significance in some way, whether psychological or spiritual or rational. They are sometimes, and wrongly in my opinion, argued to be Western values. Even if they're not always articulated as Christian anymore, values like compassion are embodied in our welfare states. Are these just natural human values? Were they God-given? Were they rational? What if they were none of these? Nietzsche starts the preface of On the Genealogy of Morality, published in 1887, with the line, "We are unknown to ourselves, we knowers, even to ourselves, and with good reason." He is asking whether some of the things we presume to know require a deeper look. He wants to ask whether what seems rational or obvious on the surface might have a deeper meaning, a hidden meaning, and for good reason. Take the idea of good. It's something we use every day, but what does it really mean? And as Nietzsche says, under what conditions did man invent the value judgments, good and evil? Nietzsche's contemporary, Paul Ree, had argued that what was good had evolved over time through natural selection. Darwin had published On the Origin of Species in 1859, and of course it had had a huge influence. For an evolutionary thinker, the 7 deadly sins are deadly sins because they are actually deadly. Darwin's natural selection can apply to concepts in the mind, as well as to biology. But Nietzsche asks, what if the opposite were true? What if a regressive trait lurked in the good man? Likewise a danger, a seduction, a poison, a narcotic, so that the present lived at the expense of the future. He begins the first essay, Good and Evil, Good and Bad, by criticising those that define good as that which is simply useful to others, that which is selfless. He is attacking the utilitarians, people like John Stuart Mill. Nietzsche says that this is unhistorical. We need to excavate the meanings of words. We need to be archaeologists, engage in a genealogy. Because before good meant unegoistic, goodness was actually defined by the upper classes, the nobility, those that deemed themselves to be superior. Nietzsche examines the etymology of good and bad in European languages and finds evidence that originally good meant strong and bad meant simple, rather than, say, selfless and abusive. Take the German word for bad, schlecht. This word also means plain or simple. The Greek word for good, agathos, also meant brave and wealthy. And the Greek word kakos, bad, meant ugly and weak. Nietzsche notes that the original meanings of these words, dating back thousands of years, is very different to how we think of good and bad today. So, when did this change? If the nobility defined their own strengths as good, then what is not strong and noble is automatically bad. But Nietzsche says that if the weak are then oppressed, then they see the strength of those who oppress them as evil. We have a dichotomy emerging. He calls this dichotomy master morality and slave morality. The priestly way of thinking developed out of this slave morality. First warriors, the strong, ruled, but then an opposing idea developed, the wise. The wise tended to be physically weaker and so needed a different type of power, based in knowledge. These two ideas of power, noble and physically strong and priestly but physically weak, started to compete. Nietzsche argues that it is likely that the priestly caste and the warrior caste confront one another in jealousy and cannot agree on the prize of war. What occurred through Christianity, he argued, was a slave revolt in morality. The weak, the slavish, those who were subservient to the strong, used their dedication to the idea that wisdom was more powerful than force to then displace the strong. As Francis Bacon said, knowledge is power. What happened was not just good being something useful, but that the priestly caste took revenge on the nobility by simply inverting their values. Nietzsche calls this resentiment, and he calls resentiment a poison. He says the beginning of the slave's revolt in morality occurs when resentment itself turns creative and gives birth to values. The resentment of those beings who, being denied the proper response of action, compensate for it only with imaginary revenge. Whereas all noble morality grows out of a triumphant saying yes to itself, slave morality says no on principle to everything that is outside, other, non-self. Remember, he calls this intelligence, but also weakness. It's not black and white for Nietzsche, but he thinks we need to re-inject an element of noble morality into our culture to cultivate daring so that we do not just become tamed. We need the blonde beast of prey, even though we might be justified in retaining our fear of the blonde beast. Christian values then, like humility, selflessness, charity, recommend the limiting of power and the protection of the weak. In Christianity, power itself is a sin. Think of the 7 deadly sins: lust, gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, envy and pride. They're indulgent, individualistic. They take things in to build one's own power. They are the master morality that says, I am good, I am powerful, I will do what I want. Nietzsche says that this slave's revolt in morality begins with the Jews, who said, only those who suffer are good, only the poor, the powerless, the lowly are good, the suffering, the deprived, the sick, the ugly are the only pious people. This passage, along with others, have been used as evidence for Nietzsche's anti-Semitism, but many passages, and Nietzsche's overall nuance, put this into question. For example, he says that the history of mankind would be far too stupid a thing if it had not had the intelligence of the powerless injected into it. He also says the weak prevail over the strong again and again, for they are the great majority. They are also more intelligent. Nietzsche isn't unconditionally rejecting the slave morality, but asking us to put it into question. And although he famously declared that God is dead, really meaning that the belief in God was dying, he is not necessarily an anti-theist. Again, he just primarily wants to question. He wants to think about rekindling that noble morality, that blonde beast of prey, as he calls it. But he also argues we must be careful, we must be nuanced. He says we may well be justified in retaining our fear of the blonde beast at the centre of every noble race and remain on our guard. Rather than emphasising how thought has coalesced around opposites like good and evil, instead we should be focused on differences of degree, as he calls it. It is a sense that there aren't any absolute answers to what we value morally, but always movement, always questions, always creativity. Symbolically, God is an absolute, and so if you derive values from an idea of God, then they too are theoretically absolute. They stifle new, fluid and malleable thinking. While not mentioned in this essay, this is where Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch, the Superman, comes from. This is someone that understands both of these sides of valuation and experiments to push humanity and morality forward, continually working out new ways to live. As a thinker, Nietzsche has similarities to someone like Dostoevsky, the subject of last week's video. He questions what is thought of as rational and argues that people are much more chaotic than the rationalists suppose. In the essay On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense, Nietzsche writes, "Does nature not conceal most things from him? even concerning his own body, in order to confine and lock him within a proud, deceptive consciousness, aloof from the coils of the bowels, the rapid flow of the bloodstream, and the intricate quivering of the fibres. She threw away the key. And the reason that Nietzsche is considered an anti-metaphysical thinker is because he argues we should always question values and ethics, i.e. metaphysical systems, and think more about raw human experience. There was no doubt, though, that for Nietzsche, what would replace the values of God would be the values of the strong, the aristocratic, the new Übermensch. On balance, this comes through more than anything, but the nuance involved in this conclusion is far from as authoritarian as some have claimed.